Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to this edition of Creating the Future. So excited to be coming to you this evening or at whatever point you're watching or listening to this podcast. And we just went through a political election season, and how crazy are those always? And we had a couple political podcasts. This one's going to be a little bit different, but touches a similar subject. A lot of times there's a lot of talk of separation of church and state. And then occasionally people come and ask me about Christian civil disobedience. At what point is that, should that be practiced? I'm going to answer those questions in this podcast today. And let me just start out by saying this. I thought it was interesting that our Brandon community is putting on the very first Christmas parade that we've ever done here for our community. Now, with that, they are entertaining floats and bringing people in to do floats and things like that. And so our church was looking at doing a float. As I understand it, hearing this just a couple days ago, inside of the rules of the floats and inside of the rules of the parade, there can be nothing religious associated with the float. Hear me. This is Christmas, Christ's Mass, the day we celebrate the birth of Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world, the Christian God. And yet, inside of the Christmas parade, there is nothing religious allowed. That really birthed something in me to take a few moments and talk about the separation of church and state. And what does that really mean? Even in this political season, we made a political podcast and we talked politics a little bit on the Sunday before the election. And as we talk about that, there's always somebody that's like, well, what about separation of church and state? That's the rallying cry of the secularists. That's the rallying cry of the ACLU oftentimes. And so let me just give some short teaching on this and say, first of all, I don't know if you realize this or not, but the separation of church and state is nowhere inside the United States Constitution. You will not find it anywhere. Where you will find it is several years later, many years later, in a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote on January 1st, 1801. He's writing to the Danbury Baptist Association, and in that letter, he says that there is a wall of separation between the church and state. In fact, I'll read you the beginning of this. This is a short little letter. The first paragraph is just pleasantries. The last paragraph is just pleasantries. And there's one in the middle. It's 3 paragraphs written to them. And the one in the middle has all the content that you would care about. So just for kicks, let me read you the beginning of this leading up to the separation of church and state part. It says, believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should, and he quotes the First Amendment here, make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Now that goes on for another sentence or two in that middle paragraph, but for what we're talking about, that's what you need to see right there. And what you need to understand is that the idea of separation of church and state, as Thomas Jefferson proposed it or said it in this short little one-page letter to Danbury Baptist Association, was telling them that the government will never again create a state religion that then controls the American people. Instead, the people have a freedom of religion, which is Amendment 1. They did not want to have a government-controlled church. They had come out of that in England and other parts of the world. They didn't want to have a church that's controlled by the government. Rather, they wanted to have a free exercise of religion by the American people. And the little Danbury Baptist Association was the minority in the area they were in, and they were concerned that there could be a government movement that would make a government-formed a denomination or religion, and it would force its way into the people, and they would be left out. And so that's what Thomas Jefferson's letter is all about. It's just, and hear me, it's not saying that there cannot be religion within the government. It is saying that there shouldn't be government within religion. So the government will not control religion. It's like a one-way wall, a one-way fence, that religion is always going to get into government. That's going to happen. But government should not be getting into the business of religion. And sometimes when I say that, there's people that are like, no, the government's not supposed to be in the business of religion, not whatsoever. And I would just point this out. You know, our first president, George Washington, he took the oath of office, and what did he put his hand on? He actually went out of his way to make sure there was a Bible there, to put his hand on the Bible. the Christian Bible. What was his very first act as president? The very first thing he did once he recited that oath of office, he leaned over and he kissed the Bible, showing his reverence for it. Then he held a 2-hour prayer and worship session inside of Congress where they prayed to God for this great nation that they were founding. How did those people determine to open sessions of Congress? Well, they opened sessions in prayer. And who was going to do those prayers? Christian chaplains. How would those chaplains be paid? Through tax dollars. That is not separation of church and state at all. In fact, if that's not enough, just listen to this. In 1776, 11 of the 13 colonies required that one had to be a Christian in order to be eligible to run for political office. In 1777, the Continental Congress voted to spend $300,000. That is an absolute fortune at the time, $300,000 to buy Bibles for distribution across the nation. In the middle of a time when they had no money and they're fighting a war, they're spending a fortune to buy Bibles. Does that sound like separation of church and state, like religion cannot get into the government? 94% of the writings of our founding fathers contain Christian quotes from the Bible. The state constitutions, the original state constitutions of all 50 states mention God. Check this out. By 1815, the U.S. government had issued over 1,400 calls to prayer. That is not whatsoever separation of church and state that we frequently hear about. But you got to recognize that as this starts to happen, it causes lots of problems, and separation of church and state in the last 75 years or so starts to come into society. And in 1963, you really see this take effect as prayer is taken out of schools. Now, you can do the math on yourself and look at where America was in 1963 when prayer was taken out of schools compared to where it is today. And what you will see is that we have gone downhill considerably. In after 1963, pregnancy rates in teen girls ages 15 to 19 increased 187% in the next 15 years. With younger girls between 10 and 14, after that, it increased 553%. SAT scores had been steady for a long time, and as soon as prayer is taken out of schools, it starts declining. For 18 consecutive years, it declined. Violence increased by 544% after prayer was taken out of schools. Illegal drugs and all these uncontrollable problems started coming into the school in a way that it never had before. This is what happens when we separate church and state. It's not that the religion and the church cannot affect the state. It's that the state, the government, will never control religion. In fact, the very same man who wrote the line, separation of church and state, which was a common line, it's not like he invented it, but Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the famous line where they take that from as they quote it, he said these words. He said, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever." Think about that. Man, separation of church and state, as we've been taught it, is by and large a mistake and a mess. Okay. Now, with that being said, anytime chaos starts to ensue inside of our country, people ask me questions about when is it okay to have and practice civil disobedience as a Christian? And recognize the very fact that America was born out of civil disobedience that was preached from the pulpits. America was literally started in part because of the civil disobedience, that there was no separation of church and state. It was the church that was giving birth to the government in a lot of ways and giving birth to this new country. Now, in Romans 13, it's very clear, and what to a lot of people is like the end of the story, and I think is a little bit dangerous. Let me just read it for you. Romans chapter 13, verses 1 and 2. You could continue reading if you chose to, but you'll get the gist, and many of you are familiar with this passage. But Romans 13 says, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves." And I could keep reading, and it's saying very similar things. And the Apostle Paul here is saying, hey, you don't rebel against the governing authorities because God has put those into place. But now we start to have a problem Because when you read through the Bible, there is story after story after story of people who are literally practicing civil disobedience who become the heroes of the faith, right? At Moses' birth, you had the Jewish midwives who refused to kill the babies like they were commanded to by the government. That's civil disobedience. Daniel in the lion's den, right? He refused to stop praying, civil disobedience. He refused to pray to the king, civil disobedience, and so he gets thrown in the lion's den. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Just story after story after story that could be shared. You have Peter and John who are preaching Jesus, and they literally look at the governing authorities as they're being sentenced and put before the jury, so to speak, or before the judge, and they say the words, "Do we obey God or man?" Right? You see this throughout the Bible. In fact, at the very end, when you get to Romans 13, you will see that the Antichrist will say, everyone has to bow and worship me. The Antichrist is desiring worship, and there will be a group of Christians who refuse to worship the Antichrist, right? So which one is it? Is it Romans 13, you have to obey your governing authorities at all time? Or is it all these other stories that say there is a time for practical disobedience, right? Civil disobedience. I would also throw in here that during the Nuremberg trials after World War II, one of the things that the soldiers who were in concentration camps and fighting and doing some of the atrocities of World War II, one of the things that they pleaded was the Romans 13 plea, that they said, we weren't guilty. We were just simply doing what the Bible tells us to do, that our authorities told us to put these Jewish people and such in concentration camps, and we're just doing what they told us to do. And the judge basically replied back, isn't there a greater command? Isn't there something greater inside of the Bible than just to do that? So what does that mean? Let me first of all just say this. One of the problems is our cultural response is often a reaction out of anger to injustice. And what is called Christian values and Christian civil disobedience is oftentimes not. It actually looks a lot more like revenge than it looks like justice. It looks more like self-righteousness. It looks a little more like getting revenge and getting back even with somebody. And when Christians respond, they don't respond in rage, but they respond in patience, and they stand sure and secure, responding on the Word of God and the truth of God. It's not really a reaction, it's a response. And there's a big difference between your reactions. We all have reactions, but it's not a reaction, it's a response where you've thought it through and you're motivated out of love for the Lord and love for others. It's motivated and you're recognizing that it might cost you something within this response. And when it comes to civil disobedience, sometimes we need to look back and honor God and the emperor and make sure we keep it in the right order, right? Surrender unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. But don't get those two things confused. So when is it okay for Christians to practice civil disobedience? Let me give you just a couple quick guidelines as I see it for Christian civil disobedience. Number one, resist. A Christian should always resist a government that commands evil or is in direct violation to God's laws. When a government is allowing evil to go on, the Christian should automatically resist that. It should be automatic if it's going against the law of God. Now, secondly, we have to confront, because Christians are called to confront evil laws when they show up within that government. So when evil is being put on us, we have to confront it. When we're being told that we must do evil, as in the stories of Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and we have to not obey God, as in the story of Peter and places like this, when we are in those moments, we must confront it and we must resist it. We cannot be like some of the Christians in Germany who just watched everything go to haywire and read Romans 13 and said, well, God must have put Hitler in command. We're just going to let it go on. We have to be people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the great theologian, who would actually, in his study of the Bible, say, hey, somebody's got to do something about this. And the great Christian theologian, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, would actually be part of the Valkyrie scheme to try to get rid of Hitler. I think another thing is that by and large, Christians should respond in nonviolence, right? I work with pastors all over India and parts of the world where persecution is great and injustice against them is great. And we never say, no, punch the person back, fight back. No, you recognize that Christians are called primarily to a life of nonviolence in those kind of moments. Literally, in the face of injustice, we oftentimes turn the other cheek. Now, that's not popular. It's not easy, but that is the Christian calling. Another thing that is the acceptance of consequences. You see this throughout the Bible. Those who practice civil disobedience, we have to be willing to accept the consequences of our actions of civil disobedience. Unless you can flee to another country or whatever, you're not going to be shocked when your actions cause more beatings, right? Read the New Testament over and over and over. Things are happening to the disciples. They are being treated unjustly, but they don't fight back. They accept the consequences that are given to them because they know that there's a greater glory that's coming to them because of those consequences that the world has given to them because of the persecution. And then lastly, I would say that we need a clear witness to the truth. The act of civil disobedience should always be a clear witness to the truth. It's not just your opinion. It's not just that I don't like this, so I'm fighting against it and I'm doing it in the name of Jesus. No, you're doing it as a witness to the truth, aiming to bring about change in a way that honors God. It's got to be that way. So what am I saying? For civil disobedience in those moments where it comes up, I think it really comes down to, does the law's purposes cause me to contradict God's command to love God and love people, right? Sometimes it comes down to a question of, is there a cause that's worth fighting against because it's so directly against the things of God? It's demanding that you do something against God, or it's demanding that you somehow break God's commands. With all that being said, I think there is a time for civil disobedience. I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we're anywhere close to there yet. I am not a proponent of that. I'm not pushing that. I'm just helping us to think about it, and within the context of separation of church and state as well. Man, I hope this podcast has been good for you. I hope that it's educated you a little bit, and let me know if you have any questions or anything. In fact, one of the things I'd like to do for future episodes, if you're still watching, is make sure that you type in the comments or send me an email at brent@myrisechurch.com questions that you would like me to address in the future. And maybe when I get a few questions together, I'll make some episodes of just answering some questions that you have. I would love to answer your questions. So with that being said, make sure you hit that subscribe button down below you at the bottom of the screen. And I look forward to seeing you again next week. God bless.